So I want you to think about something a little different today. What if we could rebuild the very operating system of our society with just one single goal in mind? Survival. Now, this isn't about left-wing or right-wing politics. Not at all. It's about engineering. It's about building a system that actually works when everything else falls apart. Let's dive in. This quote, "This is the perfect place to start." Why? Because it completely flips our usual understanding of disaster on its head. It suggests that the worst catastrophes in history weren't just terrible accidents or acts of God. No, they were the logical, predictable outcomes of systems working exactly as they were designed to. Okay, so let's dig into that with a really counterintuitive idea. What if our endless, relentless pursuit of efficiency, making everything faster, cheaper, leaner, is actually making our entire world dangerously fragile?
Think about it. Markets are designed to be brutally efficient. They ask one very simple question: who can pay the most? They don't ask who needs this the most to survive. So when a crisis hits and food becomes a life or death issue, the market doesn't see human need. It sees a pricing signal. It sees profit. And here's the thing. That's not a bug in the system. It's a feature. It's the system doing its job perfectly.
To make this real, let's look at our disaster we all think we know, the Irish potato famine. Now, the story we're usually told is about a fungus, a potato blight that wiped out the crops. But the real story, the much more important one, isn't about the fungus. It's about the system that created the perfect conditions for that fungus to cause a total catastrophe. And here's the cold, hard logic of that collapse. See, for maximum efficiency, a single, high-yield type of potato was planted everywhere, a monoculture. It was the most rational thing to do until it wasn't. Because when the blight arrived, it had one single giant target to attack, one single point of failure. And with absolutely no backups, no other food sources to fall back on, the entire system just collapsed. Efficiency became a death trap.
Okay, so that was history. Now let's connect that to right now, to our reality. Because that same logic of collapse, it's embedded in the very systems we depend on every single day.
Just think about it for a second. Our just-in-time supply chains mean most supermarkets only have a few days of food on hand. Our centralized power grids mean one failure can black out an entire region. We depend on a handful of shipping lanes for almost everything we own. We've optimized and shaved away all the slack, all the buffers that could absorb a shock. We've just built new, more complex monocultures. And this efficiency trap leads to what might just be the most likely disaster we all face, the slow disaster. Now, this isn't a sudden earthquake or a hurricane. No, it's the quiet, steady, invisible decay of our essential infrastructure. It's the bridge that doesn't get repaired, the water main that doesn't get replaced, because it's always easier for politicians to cut the maintenance budget today and just push that risk onto tomorrow.
So why on earth do we let this happen? Well, it's simple human psychology, because when everything is working, we completely forget that it can fail. Prosperity gives us a kind of amnesia. The constant, easy availability of food and water and power, it creates this dangerous sense of comfort. We start to mistake today's convenience for tomorrow's permanent security. But what happens when those systems finally do start to wobble? The common story, the one from movies, is that people immediately panic. They turn on each other. It's every person for themselves. But is that what actually happens? The reality is way more interesting. You see, scarcity doesn't suddenly change who we are. It just puts a massive magnifying glass on the systems we live in, and it reveals what we truly believe about them. Behaviors like hoarding, they're not necessarily a sign of pure greed. They are a perfectly rational response from someone who looks at the system and says, I cannot trust this to take care of me and my family tomorrow. It's self-defense when that institutional trust completely breaks down. So how do you build that trust? Well, let's compare two different approaches. On the one hand, you have charity. It's well-meaning, but it can be unpredictable, uneven. It can actually erode trust if people feel it's unfair. But then you have something like rationing. Now, I know that sounds harsh, but it works for one key reason. It's predictable. It's based on a clear sense of shared sacrifice. It sends a message, we are all in this together, and that builds the trust you need for people to cooperate. And this, right here, is the absolute key. You don't need to change human nature. You don't need everyone to become a moral hero. You just need to change the structure of the game. When you design systems where fairness is the default setting, cooperation isn't some heroic act. It becomes the most logical, ordinary choice for everyone involved.
So this brings us to the big idea, the proposed solution. It's called the Civic Resilience Economy. And the best way to think about it is not as some new political ideology, but as a practical, nuts and bolts operating system for society. The core idea is simple. Start treating our essential infrastructure, food, water, energy, the same way we treat critical national software, right? You'd never want it controlled by foreign interests, you'd insist on having backups, on redundancy, and you'd be constantly scanning it for bugs and vulnerabilities. And this whole operating system is built on 3 core principles. First, absolute sovereignty over the essentials. You just don't outsource your ability to survive. Second, choose redundancy over pure efficiency. You deliberately build in those shock absorbers. And third, a local-first, networked-second approach. This makes sure that every community has a baseline of self-sufficiency before it plugs into the bigger grid.
Okay, so that's the what. But you might be wondering, how would a system like this actually work in practice? This is where it gets really cool, because the whole thing shifts away from political theory and into practical engineering. First, you have to change what you measure. We're obsessed with GDP, which basically just tracks how much money is moving around. The CRE instead uses something called a National Resilience Ledger. Now, this doesn't measure financial abstraction. It measures physical reality. It asks brutally simple questions like, how many days of food do we actually have in storage? Its focus isn't just on growth, it's on continuity. Can we keep going?
The second big mechanism here is a pretty radical shift in how we approach governance itself. It's about moving away from the endless, frankly, exhausting debates about which ism is the one true path, and instead asking a much more practical question.
You start to treat governance like an experiment. You allow different regions to test different models for managing their resources. Then, you score their performance based on real-world outcomes from that resilience ledger. Did they maintain continuity? Was it equitable? And then you simply replicate what works, and you retire or reform what doesn't. Governance in this model becomes upgradable, just like software.
So when you put all of this together, it really brings us to a fundamental choice. A choice about how we want to organize ourselves as we face a pretty uncertain future.
And the argument here is that this choice isn't about picking a side between capitalism and socialism. It's about operating on a layer beneath all of that. It's a choice between focusing on the hard physical realities of logistics or getting stuck in the mud of ideological dogma.
And this frames the ultimate trade-off, doesn't it? The real choice we have isn't about giving up all our modern comforts. It's about whether we're willing to accept some managed, predictable limits right now in order to avoid a chaotic, unmanaged, and frankly, terrifying catastrophe down the road.
Which leaves us with this one last powerful question. Is our survival something we should consciously and deliberately engineer into the fabric of our society as a fundamental right? Or are we okay with it being a privilege, one that's allocated by the brutal, random logic of a crisis? It's a question of design versus default, and that choice is up to us.